Hello and welcome back to the Dropping In Surf Show. My name is Rob Case, and today I want to talk about nerdy wave stuff again, specifically about what's called Vortex Ratio. I think I've covered it in other episodes. If you're new to the show, just know that we talk a lot about science and math in the world of surfing. And so I'm always pulling up these old research articles and trying to relate them to something that is applicable and something that's going to help us. I'm specifically a paddling technique coach, and some of this information I use in my level 1 and level 2 courses, depending on what it is. What we're going to talk about today is really level 2 stuff, wave catching, as well as getting out strategy, board selection based off of the waves, and skill assessment. So just to kind of introduce you to this topic today, I've done previous episodes on things called peel angle or orthogonal seabed gradient. I'm going to bring these things up, but in today's episode I'll review them so that you remember what those are. But in essence, scientists, they've been studying waves for decades, really, since the earliest ones I found are in the 60s and 70s. Some of the research that I'm going to quote today is actually from the 70s. And more recently, they've been looking at it in the late 90s, early 2000s. They were looking at wave parameters and surfing waves and how do we predict them, how do we create them so we can create artificial waves in the ocean. And more recently, how do we create artificial waves in a pool? So a lot of this information has actually been applied in the pools. I actually pulled up something from Kelly Slater Wave Company. It says right here, the company classifies its barreling waves based on the wave's vortex ratio, wave height, and peel angle. These are all things that we've talked about. And we've talked about the wave gradient or the bathymetry and the orthogonal gradient. And these are the things that all these scientists use in order to recreate what we see in the ocean and really understand it better. And now how we can use it as a surfer is the more that we can understand waves, the more that we can possibly predict how the wave is going to break, or at least the higher likelihood we'll have to predict how it's going to break, and therefore we can surf it better or more effectively. So I'm going to give you a quick review of some of the things that we've talked about because I want to make sure that you have a baseline knowledge of some of these words that I'm going to be throwing out. And then I want to specifically talk about one of them, which is the vortex ratio. And, really what is it? And more so, how can we use that knowledge? And there are really three areas. One is skill level assessment. When you're looking at waves and you're trying to determine, am I ready for a wave like that? Another one is wave catching, specifically positioning, or what I call the curvature of the wave or the development of the curvature. And I've talked about that in the past when we reviewed, I think Harry Knight and I reviewed one of the studies from Nick Pizzo on the development of the wave, which is the acceleration vectors and velocity vectors of a wave's development. This is specifically more about, it's a combination of the development of that, but also the curvature, being able to actually see and gauge and judge, is that where I'm supposed to set up for this wave? Or should I be further in or further out on the shoulder? And then another area that I kind of summarized when specifically about vortex ratio, it has to do with board design decisions. When you're looking at a wave and you're saying, what board should I take? It shouldn't ever be based off of paddling. And that's something that I stress a lot in my level 1 course. One of my goals is when I teach you good paddling technique, you shouldn't have to choose a board design because of the paddle out that you see in front of you, or even the paddle into waves necessarily. There's a little bit of that, but most people, they look at the conditions and they're like, oh man, it's a long paddle, I need a bigger board to paddle, or I need more volume under my chest to paddle. You don't need that. You just need better paddling technique in the short term. That's the foundation. That's the low hanging fruit. Then when you're at that point, then making a decision, you can start making decisions based on the way the wave is breaking, and that's like vortex ratio, like how big or small is the vortex ratio, and therefore does my board fit in that curve, and how do I want to surf it? Do I want to surf with aggressive nature, or do I want to be more cruisy and relaxed, and or more conservative? And where do you want to go on the wave? How do you want to recover after a maneuver? Those are the things that I want to touch on. But first, I want to quickly, let me make sure that I'm showing my full screen here. Yeah, I believe I am. Cool. So if you are listening to this, well, you're going to want to check out some of the visuals on YouTube. But I will do my best to try to describe what I'm showing on screen. So let's do a quick review of some of the terminology that I'm going to be going through. When scientists are really trying to understand surf breaks and the way that surfing waves are optimal, what are the parameters? They come down to, they've kind of summarized it into 4 main wave parameters, and there are things that affect these wave parameters. But since 2001 and actually earlier in the 70s, they were talking about a few of these. And those 4 parameters are breaking wave height, which is, hey guys, we know what wave height is. We've been dealing with wave height all the time, right? This other thing called wave peel angle, this thing called wave breaking intensity, and a final parameter called wave section length. So wave height, wave peel angle, wave breaking intensity, and wave section length. Those are the 4 parameters that they've kind of summarized, and they said, we can describe suitable surfing waves based on these 4 parameters and the combination of these 4 parameters. So just to review, breaking wave height, we're really talking about kind of the scientific height. This isn't the cultural height differences. This is from the trough of a wave to the crest, and it's an oceanographic measurement from the crest to the trough. Say that 10 times fast. So it's basically not, it's not like California or Hawaiian or East Coast or West Coast scale. This is more a scientific scale from trough to crest. And so that's kind of how they determine that. And they're basically have limited, there's been a range. In 2003, they did a study that showed that there's kind of a surfable limit range of wave heights from 1 meter to 20 meters. Of course, they say that, if you're highly skilled, you can surf something less than 1 meter. And we've seen it all the time. 1 meter is 3 feet. You can surf 2-foot wave. You can surf a 1-foot wave with big enough board. And even if you're super skilled and light on your feet, you can surf smaller waves. And then 20 meters, we've seen surfers surf bigger than that, but this was back in 2003 when we haven't really seen that much. Other than that, then they start talking about, toe-ins, and above 20 meters, they're talking about toe-in surfing, and there's certain craft around that. But that's their definition of wave height. Wave peel angle. I went into a very long discussion on peel angle, and there's a specific study that I covered on peel angle, and in level 2 I talk a lot about peel angle, what it is. Let's maybe talk about what it is specifically. So peel angle is if you're looking from top down, from basically the clouds, and you're looking down at a surf break, what peel angle is the angle between the white water line of the previous wave and the incoming line of the swell. And it's that angle between the two. So I'll show you on screen kind of what that looks like here. So it's this angle here. Here's the whitewater line of the previous wave. You can see it here. There's the whitewater line of that previous wave. And then this is the oncoming swell that's coming up. And so the angle is the angle between there. And essentially what they're saying with peel angle, they're saying here perhaps the most critical parameter to determine whether a wave can be surfed other than wave height is peel angle. That's a pretty strong statement, but that's one of the reasons why I cover peel angle in great detail, and how do you use peel angle to set up where you should be catching waves, and also where you should be paddling out. If a peel angle is not within a range that can be surfed, then the wave is said to be unsurfable, according to the studies. So you can actually have really, really high peel angles up to 90 degrees. That's always a possibility. A Waikiki wave is 90 degrees. It doesn't really peel one way or the other, just kind of breaks straight. But you can't do as much on a wave with a peel angle that's high. A wave peel angle that is too low, though, a zero peel angle, which is basically a closeout, it's not really a surfable wave. You can't surf it. You have the drop, and that's about it. So they basically summarize it anywhere from about 0 to 20 degree peel angle is unsurfable for the most part, unless you're getting towed in. You just don't have enough time to get down the line to do anything. It's considered too fast to surf. So low peel angles break too fast to surf. And they summarize it actually quite well. The difference between a surfable beach and a non-surfable beach is often that peel angles are just too small, right? So you can have high peel angles, and it could be a surfable beach. I actually surfed, it was a beach yesterday with my son, and it was like a 90 degree peel angle. It didn't peel at all. We basically went straight on these big longboards, but it was great for him when he's learning, right? So you can do it. It's just you can't do as much. You're not really hanging 10. You're not ripping big turns on a peel angle that's 80 to 90 degrees, but you can still surf it. And there's kind of a sweet spot with that. And in that other podcast, I talk about what those sweet spots are for takeoff, for a cutback, for a vertical reentry, for a barrel ride. There are all these peel angles that they covered in that study in 2003, which I love using that as just an example because they really got into the weeds on that one. So let me just make sure that I got everything for here. Peel angle. Let's chat a little bit about peel angle and some of these vectors that come out of it. So I have on the screen the example of peel angle, where we have point A, which is the top. This is a left. I'm looking at a left right now. So point A is the top left point of the peel angle. It's basically the angle vertex. And point B is like the white water line. It's the end of the white water line. It's the space in between the previous swell line and the next swell line. And then you have a couple different vectors. So that's vector V subscript S. You have a straight line down from point A down to the next swell line, which is V subscript W vector. And then you have a vector that goes from A across the top swell line, perpendicular. That's called VP. And let me explain what some of these are. Like VW is probably the easiest one to describe, and that is when you're in, it's basically the direction that the swell energy is going. They call it the velocity of propagation, which is basically how fast this wave is going. And I've talked about it in level 2, and I think I've talked about it on one of the very, very early podcasts, like one of the first 4 podcasts that we recorded. We talked about how fast waves are moving into beach. perpendicular. Just kind of, if you were to say it's not even peeling or you're ignoring the peel angle, the velocity of propagation is basically just how fast that swell is moving into the shoreline. And that's that vector V subscript W. And that can be measured based off of wave height, generally speaking, that we found. So there's one vector. Now, perpendicular to that, right, because that's basically the same vector that a 90-degree peel angle would make. Right, but so VW would equal VS if it was a 90-degree peel angle. It'd just be going straight into the beach, right? And so that energy transferred to you is equal or similar or the same. Now VP, which is actually traveling parallel to the swell line, the outer swell line, that is perpendicular to VW. And now that vector is a really special vector. It's called peel rate. Now, peel rate and peel angle, I briefly touched on it on a previous podcast, but peel rate is actually a slightly more accurate measurement of how a wave will peel down the line, because you're going to have different peel rates, and when you talk about rate, it's basically distance over time. It's velocity. It's a rate at which, how in this wave in particular, how fast it peels to as a left, to our visual right, but to the surfer's left, right? So how fast is that peel rate peeling? So the rate is a little bit different than the peel angle, but they are very closely related. The reason why in history they've used peel angle is that it's easier to measure via photographs than peel rate. Peel rate is a little bit more tricky to actually measure. So the peel rate is the velocity the wave breaks or peels along the wave's crest to, in this case, to the left of the surfer's left, right? So you have wave propagation going straight in, you have peel rate going to the surfer's left, and it's going that way in a certain speed or direction. And so then the angle in between that the white water takes, that the actual peel line, that is the resultant velocity vector, V subscript S. It approximately the surfer's speed if the surfer remains close to the wave's break point. So, or in the pocket. So if technically the surfer just rides in the pocket as close as possible, they should be moving at a similar speed as this V subscript S vector, from point A to point B. Of course, that's if we're just trimming the whole time and just kind of moving along. We may go faster if we end up pumping, or we hit a pocket and we come down. There's a lot of changes in speed that a surfer actually has. But this is a little bit deeper of a conversation around peel angle, and this is why I think peel angle, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit later, how it relates to braking intensity or wave vortex, in terms of wave catching and positioning. This plays a huge role in positioning. Where do you line up along this wave's crest, and it has a huge impact on timing, what I call timing, which is how far out from the beach you need to set up in order to catch the wave. So that is peel angle. So let's move on to wave breaking intensity, which is that third parameter. Wave breaking intensity, it sounds deep and strong, and this is essentially what we're going to be discussing, is the details of this. They describe there are different types of waves. So the basic oceanography definitions of waves breaking are spilling, plunging, and collapsing and surging. So those four. Surfers really only ride spilling and plunging waves. Plunging waves are like barreling waves. Spilling waves are kind of mushy kind of waves, right? So back in 2001, these two scientists used this kind of general concept to investigate the relationship between the the vortex shape, or the barrel of the shape of the barrel, and the various parameters, and just to see, okay, can we use this kind of ratio of length to width of this barrel, or can we relate the roundness of the barrel to braking intensity? And they found a lot of different correlations, which I will go to in a minute. And they came up with actually a linear relationship between the vortex ratio, which is the length to the width of that barrel, to the orthogonal seabed gradient. So orthogonal seabed gradient is essentially relating to the seabed, or the bottom bathymetry, and orthogonal means 90 degrees. So it's basically as a swell comes in at a certain angle, whatever it's orthogonal with in terms of the feature underwater, that's the seabed, and the gradient is the change in depth of the seabed. So as it's the change in depth of that line, or that vector that swell is coming in on. So if it's coming from really, really deep to really, really shallow, and that swell is coming right along that line of deep to shallow, then that is a very steep orthogonal seabed gradient. That could be like pipeline, Teopu. It could be really slabby kind of waves. Black's Beach in San Diego comes up through the canyon. But Black's is actually a great example because you have a lot of refraction come out of the canyon. Moss Landing's another one where you have this deep water canyon offshore. And if the angle is coming straight down that canyon, and then all of a sudden hitting really, really shallow water, you have really, really high seabed gradient, and therefore higher breaker intensity. There's this relationship between the seabed gradient and this vortex ratio, and it's a linear relationship, which means, and this is what we're going to get into, linear relationship means that you can measure it, you can predict it. It's along a straight line of this relationship between the two. And so this 2001 study was fascinating because they measured the angle, they measured the height, they measured the width and length and those ratios, and they found that the most highly correlated parameter of all of them had to do with this orthogonal seabed gradient. So there is a seabed gradient that is natural, and that is, that's not what we're talking about. Orthogonal seabed gradient specifically means the angle that the swell is coming in to the gradient of the bathymetry at that along that vector that the swell is moving across. So you could have at like Black's Beach or at Moss Landing, where you have this deep water canyon, or even Nazare, you have these deep water canyons, and if the swell is coming right up the canyon 90 degrees, you're going to have the greatest braking intensity potentially. If the swell angle is coming more from a different angle, kind of sideways, it's going to be a different orthogonal seabed gradient that energy hits, and that gradient changes possibly from a little bit shallower. It won't be such a difference between deep water and shallow water, and so the braking intensity isn't as strong. And then you have like certain seabed orthogonal seabed gradients, like at like San Onofre, or up here at Bolinas, or in Santa Cruz at like Jack's or Privates, or Cowles, where the seabed gradient is very, very slow and very, very low, where when the swell is coming orthogonally to it, it progresses very, very slow, and so that intensity is very low. And so they found this great correlation. That's what I want to talk about today. Here's a picture of the vortex ratio. So what I'm showing here, it's a view of a barreling wave from kind of like a channel. It's a right, and it's coming toward the camera, and it shows the height the height of the breaker, which is subscript B. It has a almondy shape around the barrel, and so it's curving. It's basically showing that almond shape of the barrel itself, where the width is from the face of the wave to the lip in the middle of the barrel, or roughly in the middle, kind of up near kind of the widest part, and then the length is from the upper part of the curve inside the barrel down to where the lip breaks. And then there is actually an angle as well. There's a vortex angle, which is the angle. They don't describe it in the study, but they just show this same view here. The angle is, it appears to be the angle at which the lip strikes the water in front of it. But I think they may describe it differently. It's more of the angle that the vortex ratio makes with that water. So those two descriptions sound really similar, but I think they're slightly different because when you look at the picture, it's kind of like taking this almond and putting it more upright or putting it more flat, and that's similar to how the lip line strikes the water, but there's a slight variance in there. So I'm gonna scroll down to that last parameter, and then we're gonna go deep into that one in a moment. But we're gonna scroll down to wave section length. So when you look at a wave from an aerial perspective and you see the peel angle, well, the peel angle is only for a certain period of time or a certain section length, and so many waves, especially beach breaks, you have like a section and then it kind of closes out and then there's another section. So when you're riding along a wave, you're going to actually have different section lengths and you're going to have different peel angles, and you'll also have different breaking intensities. And so and different heights as well. Some waves are actually growers, like G-Land is a grower, where it starts out a little bit small and then it grows as it goes down the reef. So these 4 parameters are always changing on the same wave that you may be surfing. And so they specifically mention wave section length because it changes, right? It could be different winds that mess up the sections, that blow a section over. It could be the bathymetry or the feature underwater that changes something. It could be broken up because there was sheltering offshore, or wave interactions as they come in. So there's a lot of reasons why a wave might section and have a bunch of different sections. But it basically says here, a surfing ride is actually made up of a variety of sections, breaking with varying heights, peel angles, breaker intensities, and section lengths throughout the ride. For example, small sections that break at once with a peel angle near 0 are not a problem for a surfer, provided the surfer can generate enough speed to make it past the section to the unbroken wave crest. So that would be like if you're looking at a wave and you're saying, hey, you know what, there's this section here that it closes out. It's a peel angle of near 0. I can't surf that wave because it has that section. Nobody would say that. It just says, well, is there a section maybe earlier on the wave that I can get up and get some speed so I can travel through that section or past that section so I can get to the next section? Or should I get up after that closeout section and start from there? So there are these decisions that we would make when we see these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can't surf those section lengths. So if that section length is too long, then it would be difficult. But the more advanced surfers have ways to generate speed before and maybe even go up and over those sections, either through an aerial or a floater, whereas a less skilled surfer would get stuck or get caught behind on those sections. Sections like that, they go on here, they say, in fact, sections can be desirable for advanced surfers. And if the section has a high enough breaker intensity, there's a chance of getting a barrel ride. So remember, they're associating breaker intensity to that vortex ratio a great deal. And that vortex ratio is linearly related to the orthogonal seabed gradient. So we're starting to kind of see how these things all kind of work together. They go on to say in this study, they talk about some winds onshore, offshore, and then they kind of get into the first of the three things that I want us to talk about, which is the skill level assessment. And I'm going to kind of pause there, and we're going to go into vortex ratio in a little bit more detail and then come back to this. So let me go to the study here for vortex ratio that was done in 2001. It's called Predicting the Breaking Intensity of Surfing Waves by Shaw Mead and Kerry Black down in New Zealand. And let's talk about some of the different things that they created to better figure out kind of like this relationship of orthogonal seabed gradient. So they used a program called MATLAB. I remember using this in my undergrad to fit a cubic curve to crest parallel images of breaking waves. This was back in 1997, they started playing around with this. 1999 was another study that they were playing around with this, and then this one was finally published in 2001. But once again, this is where they start to define this vortex ratio, and what they were trying to figure out in this study was, well, what is the relationship to breaking intensity? So let's just kind of try and understand this without the math. So if we have this ratio of length to width of the barrel, you have waves like, and I'll throw up, let's throw up Teahupo'o. So you have a wave I'm showing on the screen of a huge wave at Teahupo'o that has this really kind of, it's almost like it's as wide as it is long, right? So if I were to, again, mark this up and draw on this, you have this kind of almondy shape, and you have this length that goes all the way to where it breaks, and then you have this width that's, not as, everyone says that, oh, that thing broke as wide as it is tall, right? This is the wave height is kind of, here from the crest down to the trough, right? And it is, the wave height is almost as long as the vortex ratio length. But the vortex ratio is really the length from where the lip is hitting to kind of the furthest end point of the vortex, or the almond or ellipse kind of thing, kind of shape, to the widest part, which is, the widest part of the almond or the shape. And so that's vortex ratio. I'll show you another picture, same spot, and you can see there's that length there, and then the width is kind of like right up there. That's like the widest part of it. And so most surfing waves, I kind of thought about this, and I was like, when you have length over width, you're always going to have a number that's greater than 1, because all surfing waves always have a longer L than the W in terms of when it's actually throwing over. And I thought to myself, as just kind of a challenge, is there ever a wave where W is bigger than L, meaning the ratio is less than 1? And I don't think it's possible to have that, because as the swell gets higher or bigger, it just throws over, and it throws out into the flat area more. So I started thinking about how vortex ratio really has a lot to do also with decision making when we're going out through the waves, and where should you duck dive? Should you speed up your paddle? Should you slow down? Should you wait for the bounce, or should you try to get into the barrel and duck dive? And there's this really high risk area in between those two decisions. Or should I avoid that area completely because it's breaking in super hyper shallow water and it's going to hold me back? So these are all things we talk about in level 2 in terms of getting out strategy. Getting out strategy saves you tons of energy. But it's also directly related to vortex ratio. And I couldn't think of any examples where the width is wider than the length of the vortex ratio. So unfortunately, I don't think it's possible, but I'd love to hear from you guys if you have an idea of where the width of a vortex is even with the length would be pretty incredible, but I don't think it's possible. So like I said earlier, I thought that there would be a greater relationship between the angle, the vortex angle, which is the angle at which this almondy shape strikes the water in front, the flat water in front, or the flats, where the lip hits down, and the ratio itself and the intensity. And what they found, interestingly enough, when they did this, they actually mapped the angle, the length on width, the wave height, the width on wave height, the vortex angle of several different wave locations, and they got a lot of different vortex angles even at the same place. Like they had 5 different backdoor waves at backdoor pipeline, and they had vastly different vortex angles. And I thought, the higher the vortex angle, the greater the intensity. You're thinking that, it throws over and throws down, and you would think that would be very, very intense the closer it got to 90 degrees. But, the length to width has a much larger impact on intensity, and some of the longer ratios, the smaller ratios, didn't quite correlate with the higher vortex angles. Like there was a vortex angle of 58 degrees, but the length to width of the vortex was 2.21, whereas there was a vortex ratio of 2.02, which is a more intense wave. Meaning the length is longer than the width, and the vortex angle was 50 degrees. So you would think that it would be higher than that, but it was not. So they had a lot of inconsistencies with the vortex angle. And so let me scroll down to some of those where they kind of related them. So the mapping or the scatter plot that I'm looking at right here is you have vortex angle degrees on the x-axis and the vortex height to width ratio. So they're actually looking at the height of the wave to the width of the vortex, that ratio. So if the height is much bigger, like very big compared to the width, let's say the width is really small, then you have a really high number. And so it's going to be higher on the y-axis. If you have a wider kind of wave, a wider barrel to the height, related to the height, you have a lower y-axis point. And then for the vortex angle, if you have something that kind of is curving and hitting more straight down, it's further along the x-axis to the right. And so when I think about that, I think, okay, well, with a higher angle, I would think it would strike the water at a stronger angle down, and that would be like a pipeline or a Shark Island, or they're using Shark Island in these examples, which is a slabby wave. But that's not the case. They're showing, you're going to have a lower height to width ratio in those kind of intense waves, but the vortex angle is actually small in that case. Now the softer wave, you have a higher vortex angle, but you also have a much higher height to width ratio. So that one kind of didn't really correlate too. The wave vortex angle versus the ratio of vortex length to vortex width wasn't very correlated at all, they said, in terms of linear. So they were like, well, we can't really use that as a predictor if it's not correlated. They did the same thing with the vortex angle and the width to wave height the other way around. So again, there was no correlation, or there was very little correlation. They did the same vortex angle with vortex length to wave height. So instead of taking the vortex width, they take the length. And again, they found there wasn't that good of a correlation there. They did vortex angle to the contour of the normal seabed gradient, so not the orthogonal seabed gradient, but the normal seabed gradient, meaning, it's not the line that the wave is traveling on. And they found a little bit more correlation there, but not much. And in that one, the problem is that they had 3 different vortex angles for Shark Island, vastly different vortex angles. So the consistency of vortex angle was really difficult for them to measure. And so they actually did state somewhere in here that the vortex angle was not going to be a suitable measurement because of the variability. And they said here, our results show that there is little evidence to support that wave vortex angle can be used as a measure of braking intensity. And that's, there were huge discrepancies. They're saying there were some major discrepancies between the measurements of vortex angle between the previous study and the present study. But just in this one study alone, the vortex angle at one of the breaks was like this huge range. So it's just, they even go on, the vortex angle is not a stable parameter, and it's much more difficult to measure than the length to width ratio. So they kind of cast that one aside. The other thing to do with height, they covered that as well, the wave height and period. But here's the most amazing thing they found. And I'm going to go ahead and show the orthogonal seabed gradient ratio to the vortex ratio, which is the length to width ratio. You had this beautiful linear correlation between the two. So you have this scatter plot, you have Shark Island, which is that slappy wave with a lower vortex ratio and a lower seabed gradient. So you have a seabed gradient that is very low, whereas you have a seabed gradient for Lyell Bay, which is high, and that's like kind of a really mellow sloping wave. So the higher the seabed gradient, sorry, I misspoke earlier. The higher the seabed gradient, the less variability that you have in the seabed gradient. So it's a horizontal distance to one vertical unit. So the ratio. So the slope is longer horizontally than it is vertically when it's a mellower wave like Lyell Bay or San Onofre or Bolinas or Santa Cruz, Cowles. So you have a longer horizontal distance versus the vertical unit, whereas a lower horizontal distance to vertical unit like Shark Island or Pipeline or Teahupo'o, you have a low orthogonal seabed gradient. So when you have a low orthogonal seabed gradient, meaning it changes depths really quickly, that's essentially what it means. And you have a vortex length to width ratio that is very low, meaning the length is almost even with the width. So that's what that means. The length and the width are really close proportionally. When you have that and a low orthogonal seabed gradient, you have a really intense braking wave. And they were able to find this for many, many, many different surf breaks and this linear relationship to the point where they were able to actually create a linear equation where it's the vortex ratio or the length to vortex width could actually be predicted based off of the orthogonal seabed gradient. Right, so it's 0.065 times the orthogonal seabed gradient plus 0.821 gives you the vortex ratio, which is crazy, right? And they said that the vortex ratio ranged between 1.42 and 3.43. So 3.43 it's a much longer length and not a very wide, right? 1.42 is, it's getting closer to 1, so the length is still longer than the width of the barrel, but it's a lot more round. Okay, so you have round versus kind of more almondy, right? Now, this is, of course, has to do with plunging waves only. Okay, plunging waves only. But this was fascinating, because what they did also is they took a look at wave period and wave height as well. And they found that while period and height also will change the intensity of the wave, let's go back down to the conclusion here. Where is it? Conclusion. I thought this was the most amazing thing, because I'm like, wait, you guys are forgetting about period. Here we go. Including wave height and period in this method could improve breaking intensity prediction, but the range of wave heights and periods at high quality surfing breaks is not large enough to greatly affect the general results obtained by using the orthogonal seabed gradient alone. So they're basically saying that the orthogonal seabed gradient works. You can basically predict the tube shape just off of orthogonal seabed gradient. The heights and periods at these different breaks, you could try to use those, but the orthogonal seabed gradient alone works, and you don't need to, and it's so consistent and it's predictable. So I found that really, really interesting. And then they came up with this thing right here. This is the classification of wave breaker intensities, and they just gave us a couple examples. So we'll start with the most extreme intensity. The vortex ratio is between 1.6 and 1.9. So remember, these are the descriptive terms are square or spitting. Examples are Pipeline, Shark Island are the ones they gave, and they gave a nice little picture, and you can actually see how round the barrel is. So when the barrel is more round, then that's an extreme intensity. Very high intensity, they're saying 1.91 to 2.2 on the vortex ratio. Descriptive is very hollow, things like backdoor, padang. I would even argue some backdoor waves are more like extreme, but they put backdoor here, and they show a picture of one, and yeah, it's not as round. It's a little bit more almondy, a little bit longer than it is wide. And then you have a high intensity, a vortex ratio of 2.21 to 2.5, and this is descriptive term is pitching or hollow, and this is like Kira, off the wall. Again, two places that I think get really round, but they're showing, some like a tube section of a wave. I would even say maybe high might be like J-Bay, where it is barreling in the barrel section, but it's more almondy. Definitely more almondy of a barrel. A little bit harder to actually ride in the barrel, those kinds of braking intensities. And then you have an intensity of medium high, which is a vortex ratio of 2.51 to 2.8. Descriptive term is some tube sections. And they're saying example breaks like Bells Beach has sometimes a tube section, Bingen in Indonesia. And they're showing kind of someone doing like a pocket ride right in front of one. So it's kind of a tube section, not really. And then finally, they have the intensity of medium, where the vortex ratio is 2.81 to 3.1. And the descriptive term is a steep-faced but rarely tubing. So it's got nice steep section, maybe for a turn, but you can't necessarily get barreled. Example break was Manu Bay, Wangamata, and that's in New Zealand. So they took this and actually, what some of these other studies have done, they've thrown these in. Let me see if I can find it here. Is this the one? Yeah. So they threw it in, but they ranked these also related to a surfer's skill level. So when we're talking about vortex ratio, the studies have all kind of shown that peel angle is one of the number one things that you can use to determine your kind of skill level. Actually, in an older study, let me pull that older study up. I think it's this one. Yeah. Here's an older study. This was in 2001 versus 2003, which is the other one. It actually gives a rating system. And there's a rating system altered from this to include Vortex Ratio, but I'll start with this one. So rating 1, beginning surfers not able to ride the face of a wave yet, simply move forward as the wave advances. Well, they relate this to peel angle mostly. So the peel angle is the number one determinant for skill level in their eyes, as well as wave height. So they're looking at peel angle and wave height. So they're saying peel angle limit is 90 degrees. So that's basically a wave that doesn't peel. The minimum and maximum wave height in meters, 0.7 to 1. So a rating 1 or a level 1 surfer, beginner surfer, not able to ride the face of the wave, basically riding whitewater. A rating 2 or level 2 is a surfers able to successfully ride laterally along the crest of a wave. And they said that the peel angle limit is about 70 degrees. Anything faster of a peel angle, because they don't know how to generate speed, they're not going to be able to keep up with. So any sections that are faster than, say, a 70-degree peel angle is too fast because they can't generate speed. The minimum wave height is about 0.65 meters. Maximum is about 1.5. So meaning they can ride a little bit bigger waves and they can ride a little bit smaller waves and ride down the line. A level 3 surfer is a surfer who has developed the skill to generate speed by pumping on the face of the wave. That's what we just talked about. So their peel angle limit is 60 degrees. They can't really go in waves a little bit faster than that, but they can ride smaller waves and larger waves. They said 0.6 meters to 2.5 meter size waves. A level 4 surfers beginning to initiate and execute standard surfing maneuvers on occasion. They can their limit is 55-degree peel angle, so a little bit faster of a wave, and again a little bit smaller, 0.55 meters, and actually a lot bigger of a wave, 4 meters. Level 5 surfers able to execute standard maneuvers consecutively on a single wave. A peel angle limit of 50 degrees, a little bit smaller of a wave. Again, they're just lighter on their feet. They can change things as 0.5 meters to greater than a 4-meter wave. And really from then on, every surfer from level 5 up to 10, their max wave is greater than 4 meters. But their minimum wave keeps going down. So a level 6 surfer, surfers able to execute standard maneuvers, consecutively execute advanced maneuvers on occasion. Their peel angle limit is 40 degrees, so the peel angle keeps going down, and the minimum wave height they can surf goes down. This one's now 0.45 meters. The maximum is still greater than 4 meters. A level 7 surfer is a top amateur surfer able to consecutively execute advanced maneuvers. So peel angle limit drops all the way down to 29 degrees. So this is somebody that is able to float over sections or do an air over a section with really tight peel angles. So any section lengths that are short, or section lengths can be longer as well with these, with more advanced surfers. They can surf a minimum of 0.4 meters. So that's going down as well. A level 8 is a professional surfer able to consecutively execute advanced maneuvers. Their peel angle is a little bit sharper. It's 27 degrees, they're saying, and their minimum wave height is 0.35. You see these guys, they make a 1-foot wave look super fun because they generate all this speed. A level 9 surfer is a top 44 professional surfer able to consecutively execute advanced maneuvers. This is back when they had the ASP and they had the top 44. The peel angle limit, they say not available, but they can surf as small a wave as 0.3 meters effectively. And then a level 10 is surfers in the future. Keep in mind, this is a 2003 study. Peel angle, they didn't know what the limit was as well, and they said 0.3 or less. But essentially, they're not really even sure, surfers in the future, meaning today even, if they redid this and looked at some of the peel angles that some of these guys are able to surf through, and how small these guys can go in wave heights and do advanced maneuvers. Anyway, I bring this up because I think it's a good way you can look at peel angle as one way to assess whether you're ready for a particular wave. But I like the newer version of what they've done. I'm going to pull that back up, where they incorporate also not only peel angle, but they incorporate vortex ratio. So a lot of times, I've talked on the podcast before about how you should, oh no, it wasn't the podcast. It was a blog post that I said, it's not a matter of wave height in terms of how you should assess your skill level. It shouldn't be wave height. It should be in the intensity, or whether or not you feel comfortable getting caught inside. That's specifically what I said. How comfortable do you feel getting caught inside? And then the breaker intensity. Vortex ratio is much more related to that, because if you have a rank 2-3 surfer, they're saying here, beginner surfer is able to perform basic maneuvers, soft breaking waves. There's no vortex ratio, and the peel angle is 60 to 70 degrees or greater. They don't really have a vortex. They're kind of spilling waves. They're not plunging waves. So as soon as you move from, say, a spilling wave, which is like a crumbly wave, to a plunging wave, you've moved up in your progression, and now you're dealing with vortex ratio. And so here on screen, I'm showing this is a 2003 study showing the different kind of ranks or levels of surfers: rank 4, rank 5, 6, rank 7, rank 8, 9, and the vortex ratio increases. Vortex ratio decreases. So a rank 4 is intermediate skilled surfer beginning to initiate and execute standard surfing maneuvers on occasion, steep face but rarely tubing. Vortex ratio 2.8 to 3.1. Peel angles 55-degree limit. And you got Bell's Beach or Raglan in New Zealand. So they're doing essentially the same thing. I'm not going to go through every single one. The top ranked are the top world surfers. Vortex ratio 1.6 to 1.9. Peel angle less than 27 degrees. And they're saying like Pipeline, Shark Island in Australia, and everything in between. So this is just another way I think you can use vortex ratio to kind of assess your own skill level. So that was one of my goals for today, is to talk to you about how you can use vortex ratio and look at the way the tube throws. If there's no tube, then it's less than a rank 2-3. It's kind of, you're dealing with a spilling wave, and you should be okay. Then you can look a little bit more at peel angle in that case. But I'm going to just kind of wrap up here and talk to you about the other two ways that we can use vortex ratio to help our surfing. One way is with wave catching, and really specifically your positioning on a wave. So if you have a section of a wave that has a really low vortex ratio, meaning that it's tubing really, really hard, that is not a place where you're going to be taking off. Especially also if the peel angle is low at that same location, which generally it is. Those things are somewhat related, though we haven't seen that correlation yet. But it is peel angle and vortex ratio and orthogonal seabed gradient all kind of are related, as we've discussed. So what you want to look for is, when you're looking at the side of a wave, you want to look at what I call the curvature of the wave. And it's not once the wave is tubing or it's vortexing, it's what happens before it gets to that point and that progression. And this relates back to the podcast that Harry and I did together on the study from Nick Pizzo in terms of the development of the wave. And we're talking about the curvature of it. So when you look at the curvature of these different vortex ratios, you don't really want to take off when it's vortex ratio is 1.6 to 1.9. You want to take off before it becomes that. And so the curvature of the wave is a good predictor of how much the vortex ratio is going to throw or not throw, given a surfing section. So remember, there's different sections. So we go deeper into this in level 2, but just right now, what you can do as kind of a general practice is, while you're paddling out and you're looking at the wave as you're paddling out, and you see the way that the wave curves, you can kind of imagine yourself at that section of the wave and saying, does that wave develop based on its curvature and vortex ratio? Does it develop really quickly? Do I want to try to get into it before that? Does it give me enough of a ramp to get into it beforehand so that maybe I can ride through that vortex ratio section. Could that be possible? And then you can also look at the peel angle to see, is that a closeout section as well, or is that a mushy section? So would I tuck into the tube during that section, or would I try to go over it? If it's a mushy section, if it's a spilling section, I can actually come up and take a turn off of that top and get more speed coming out of that and for the next section. So it really helps you plan out how the wave might break and how you might surf it, as well as how to catch the wave. So I only focus on how to catch the wave. I kind of extended that discussion toward how to ride it, but how to catch the wave and where you want to catch the wave, the positioning along the beach that you want to go at, has a lot to do with where the vortex ratio, how extreme it is, how intense it is, and where it happens. So the peel angle of it. So it's combining peel angle and vortex ratio. And then the last thing I want to kind of talk to you about with vortex ratio is the board design decisions that you're going to make. So speaking, relating it back to the section that you're looking at and the vortex ratio of that section. Of course, if the vortex ratio is more intense, if you have a longer board, you're not going to be able to fit it into that curve. So think about it that way. Like if you have a curve that is very steep and you have a longer board, that board is not going to actually fit in the curve of that wave. It's going to end up going and nose poking, basically purling, right? So when you think about the lower the vortex ratio, the more the intense the vortex ratio, the smaller the board you essentially want to have to fit that curve. And that's not just one takeoff, but let's say you come up and I'm showing a wave at Teopu again, and if you come up and you do a top turn and then it bowls out really quick, you need a smaller board to fit that curve to come down and recover. So it's not just on takeoff that you need that board to fit the curve, but every time you go up for a vertical turn, you need to do that. I've come into many problems when I'm learning my vertical turns as I come around and I have maybe a bigger board to provide me with a little bit more leniency when I mess up and I lose speed. Having a bigger board helps me through the flat sections a little bit more. And so the problem is I could turn it, but then I'm stuck. I always nose poke when I'm coming down. So it could be some of my technique of my recovery, but to me, it makes more sense that the board doesn't fit the curve, because I've surfed the same wave, and this is a wave pool specifically, on a shorter board, and it fits the curve. Right. So that's a huge difference. So when you're thinking about board decisions, think less about your paddle out and more about how it's going to fit the curve. And so vortex ratio has a huge impact on that. You can ride, I ride my mid-length out at OB when it's kind of mushy, because it doesn't need a short water line to fit the curve, because the curve is very mellow. But when it's top to bottom low tide, I'll take a small board out there, even if it's big, because one, I know how to paddle a small board efficiently and effectively, even through a lot of whitewater moving along and a lot of water moving. I can catch waves in the right sections in order to fit that board into that curve. And really what I'm looking at is I'm not looking at the waves on and deciding on a board based on how I should catch the wave or my paddle out. I'm looking at how does my board fit in the curvature of the wave, and how do I want to ride? And so that's how I want you to start to approach surfing, is once you get good paddling technique down and you know how to catch waves at different parts and where kind of might be a higher probability of catching a wave at different sections along the wave, given your skill and your knowledge, you can decide on a board for that session with greater accuracy, and you can end up having a lot more fun when you do it that way. So that's kind of my roundup. I know I kind of jibber-jabbered on about vortex ratios quite a bit. I hope that you got something out of it. If you did, great. Let me know. If you didn't, let me know. I know I can get onto this nerdy stuff for a while, but if you do find interest in it, I'm stoked that you found some value out of it. Of course, if you're interested in taking my level 1 course, we have the online course available for you, or you can come out and see me in person. And then I don't let anybody take my level 2 course until we go through level 1, because a lot of the basics for sprint paddling and setting up is covered in level 1. So even if people are pros and ex-pros, I start at level 1. I don't even go to level 2 with them. We're always talking about level 1 stuff. So whether someone's a not advanced beginner all the way to an ex-pro, we always start at level 1, and that's paddling technique. And then we move on to wave catching. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you guys for listening. If you listened this whole time, I appreciate it. And send me questions if you have any. Until then, I'll see you in the water.